Hello everybody, hope you're doing okay and welcome to Armona. I'm still here, coming back to the UK shortly. So I've got my running sort of Christmassy t-shirt on, so I hope you like that. So my last video about analysing people's training and their training paces seemed to go down well. So I've done a similar one today where I'm looking at what is your best event. Now my best event was always the 8 and 15. I think the 1500 was slightly better, but then I did spend 20 years really basically targeting that event and nothing else. So traditionally, the further I went, the worse I got. So even though my marathon of 2:33, I was pretty pleased with in the end, it was actually my weakest event. So what I've done is I've tried to analyse everyone's best event group and see what we can see and whether the events that people are targeting actually reflect what they're actually technically best at. So another one, it's going to be quite long-winded. I'm going to go through the same sort of YouTubers and athletes that I know to sort of see how their sort of best events stack up with each other and see what we can see. And I've also looked at Power 10 data to do a more general sort of population sampling to see what the general patterns are. And it's quite interesting that, spoiler alert, that most people seem to be worse at the marathon and potentially most people seem to be best at the 5K. That doesn't necessarily always reflect what people are actually targeting. Most people, I think, especially on YouTubers, tend to sort of focus on the marathon, but it's interesting that not that many people are actually that good at the marathon relatively, according to the methods I was using to determine it. So let's step over the computer and have a look. Okay, let's start off by looking at myself. And what I've done here is I've grouped together all the different distance events into 5 groups. So representing the 5 most popular distances, I would say. So we've got the mile, the 5K, the 10K, the half marathon, and the full marathon. So what I've done is that if it's any sort of event that's like an 800, a 1500, a mile, I group that into the mile group. If it's, say, a 3K or a 4 mile or obviously a 5K, I group that into the 5K. The 10K would also include, say, events like the 5 miles, very similar distances. And the half marathon would be things like the 10 mile as well. And the marathon is obviously anything that's a marathon or in fact anything a bit higher. So what I wanted to do is to see which event you're actually best at. And also I've done it into all time is the yellow and the pink is just the last 3 years to see if there's any difference. So for myself, I was traditionally an 800, 1500 meter runner for most of my running career until I got to nearly 40 when I took up the marathon. So somewhat unsurprisingly, my best event is the mile group, and my actual best performance came in the 1500 with a 3:55.5 in 1992. And including all the mile races I did, the 1500 meter races, the 800 meter races, things like that, I did 333 of them altogether. And in fact, I'm still going ahead. So what I've done is rank the performances by the point system we use on Run Britain rankings to determine the handicaps and the national ladder. I'll go into the scoring details a bit more, but my 1500 there on 3:55.5 would have scored minus 1.84 points. The next event group I'm best at is the 5K, and as you can see, I seem to get worse as the distances go up. So even though my marathon I thought was quite a respectable 2:33, that is actually my worst event group. And my 5K best time was 15:26, my 10K was 32:17, all the way back in 1989. Seems like a different lifetime ago. The half marathon and marathon came in the same period before London Marathon in 2005. Now, if you also compare that to what I've done the last couple of years, it's kind of similar. My best event group is still the mile. My actual best performance in the last 3 years came in the 800, 2:18.59 last year. And then a slight juggling of things. The marathon is still the worst, even though it was a respectable 2:56 last year in Seville. But then there's a bit of juggling because I did a good 10-mile time in the Great South Run in 2019, 61:40. So that actually is the second best group. And then the 5K and the 10K. Let's have a look at all the other YouTubers and other athletes I used in my previous video talking about their training mileages and paces. So here we are, starting from the top. And what I've done is ordered these by the athlete ID on Power of 10 and Run Britain rankings. So my athlete ID is 628. So if you wanted to look up anybody, just go to your own profile and change the athlete ID from your one to the number here on the left-hand column. So Terry Booth is the prolific 5,000 metre runner. He's just recently turned an M55 and I'll be joining him in 3 weeks' time. So his best event traditionally was the 5K. His best performance ever was a 14:32. And I'm not totally sure I've got his PBs right, but the ones I could find, his next best event is the mile group, the 1500 or 355. I think he may actually have done a bit quicker than that. That's the fastest I could find. And then those 4 groups are one he did at the time. And the marathon he's only done more recently. So it's interesting to look over to more recent years. And he actually is best at 5K. He was racing 5Ks really, really often, and significantly better there at 5K than at 10K, and then half marathon, and then the mile. Terry's not perhaps the fastest of people in an 800 or a 1500 these days, but still a very respectable performance, far better than me at just over 5 minutes. But compared to his 5,000, not half so good. So what it looks at me, Andy Greenleaf is a sub-elite marathon and half marathon runner. Interestingly, his best event is the half marathon, just slightly better at 66.25 than his full marathon, and then he then drops off as the distances go down. He hasn't really ever raced too many miles. I've only found sort of 5 800 to mile races, and his best of 4:25, very respectable, but it doesn't really compare quite as well to the longer distances. Steve Winder is the guy that does a lot of cycling. He hasn't actually done a road marathon yet. I think he's done a trail marathon, but I couldn't really use that as a proper time. And his best times, traditionally, his best time was a 10K. In fact, one of these athletes that is actually probably doing better recently than he did as a senior. Some of his times of late, almost quite comparable to his performances in the past, like say a park run there in 16:32 compares quite well to what he did considerably younger in a 10K of 33:45. But again, Steve's the sort of a guy that doesn't have a lot of basic speed relatively, so not surprisingly his 1500 is down the bottom there. If we move up to Stephanie Davis, who was the first British woman in the Olympics in the marathon, unsurprisingly her best event is the marathon. Now here's an interesting one that completely reversed to me. Her best event is the longest, and it goes worse as distances get shorter, although to be fair, her 1500 time is from a long time ago, so I think that time would be a lot better. In fact, I think that 1500 speed is probably slower than a park run time there. But anyway, it does sort of illustrate the point that somebody who's an elite athlete representing GP in the marathon, that actually is their best event, which, as we'll see later on, isn't always the case. And it's still a very respectable half marathon. Perhaps does reflect also the fact that it doesn't race these sort of shorter distances half as much to the same sort of standard. Now, Phil Seseman's an interesting one because he's actually raced the mile sort of group 130 times, by far the most. And until recently, you kind of thought that he was a short distance racer. But interestingly, the 1500 is actually, the mile is actually his worst event group, and his best event group is the 10K. So a very good all-rounder here. I mean, if you look at the differences between his point scores for the 10K and the 1500, very close. In fact, we'll go on later to say that he's the best all-rounder of all the people I'm featuring here in terms of the difference between the score for his best group and his worst group. But he's recently taken out the marathon. He's only done one at 2:12, so an amazing debut. But it's already better in point scores than his 1500, despite the fact that he's basically formed most of his career, either that or 5Ks. So very interesting to see that sometimes you may not be in the best event that you think, but I think certainly when you're a younger athlete, specialising in the shorter distances makes a lot of sense. Now, my friend Phil York, who's M55 getting on for 60, he was basically a steeplechaser, but also he had to be quite good at 3,000 on the flat and 1,500. And interestingly, I can't really score his steeplechases, but his 1,500 and 3,000 there, in fact, score identical points, minus 1.01. So I think it must be on the third decimal place that the 1,500 just took it. But it's interesting to see that somebody who was a track runner specialising of that 3,000 distance on the steeplechase, unsurprisingly, is also their best events were those two events as well. And then as the distances went up, Phil's still a very accomplished 5 mile runner there, 25:09. I don't think he raced the 10 mile and the marathon anywhere to the same levels. Especially didn't run a marathon until much later in his career, when he was obviously well past his best. So that marathon there, isn't really reflective of what he's capable of. But you can see that even so, you probably would have struggled to actually get that marathon down to what those times would have been, which probably would have been at least sort of sub 2:30 or better. So Ollie Garrod is another one who is actually better at the longer events. He really is best known as a ultra runner come marathon runner. He has represented GB in some ultra races, but he does actually race prolifically at all distances. In fact, I think he's the person that's possibly now won in inverted commas the first finish the most number of park runs worldwide. He's done 453 5Ks. I think most of them are probably park runs, but very respectable 15:12 on the track. And his mile time isn't too bad, 4:35, but doesn't compare anywhere near as well as his marathon and half marathon. And some of the example that the longer the better for him. Now, Jack Rowe is an elite athlete, hasn't yet done a marathon, but he's got a very tight range. His miles, the sub 4 miler there, which interestingly, talk about his worst event. It's a bit ironic. You talk about somebody's worst event when they're a sub 4 miler, but on this point scoring system I use, his 10K is actually better than his mile, and the half marathon 3,000, and he's slightly worse than the 10K. So very good all round. I think he's going to run a good marathon when he takes to it. Dan Jarvis is another sort of elite athlete, pretty much. He's only done the one marathon. Doesn't look like that was really reflective of his best event. I vaguely recall that marathon maybe in the Olympic trials as a pacer, so I think we'll probably discount that one. But even so, that was his worst event, in inverted commas. His best event is the 5,000, and only a slight drop off to the other ones. Not quite a 4-minute miler, but 3:38, still very, very good, and also well under 15 minutes for the 10 miles. Now, Chris Ness is my clubmate, who's the person that nicked all my club records, and one of the guys that doesn't actually train that much in terms of mileage, but does a bit of strength work in the gym, some rowing, some biking and stuff. It's interesting in a way that he's probably on age graded, he's actually doing better now as an M50 master than he was as a senior. His best 800 ever was only 2:3, say only 2:3 compared to some of these elite guys. But that still was his best event, including the 8s, 15s and miles, and considerably better than his next best event is the 10K and the 5K, represented by a 3,000 there. But the 3,000 was actually more recent. You see there that those oldest events were ages ago. If we look over to what he's done in recent years, and he very much follows the pattern of perhaps a low mileage runner, that he's best at the short events and it gets progressively not as good as the distances go up. And he has done some sort of off-road sort of trail races and stuff, but no formal half marathons or marathons. But you would have kind of imagined that performance will also drop off. I mean, I'm sure he's capable of doing a lot better, but just chooses to target the events where he does the double decathlons. So he obviously needs to not do too much running to keep up that as well. Now, Mark Symes, he's the guy that's the fastest M50 1500 metre runner this year in the UK. And unsurprisingly, in that sense, he is actually best at the mile. In recent years, he's only actually done the mile of the 5K. I think that the 5K is all represented by either 3,000 track races or park runs. But yeah, you can see there that even as an M50, he's still doing 2:2, which is incredible times really for someone of that age. But he has run a 2:36 marathon in 2015, and he's got quite tight range. But you can see that obviously now prefers the shorter distances, and to a marginal extent, he's actually better at them. But very impressive running. Amritpal is a fellow YouTuber, and he's one of the few people in the world to have run all 6 marathon majors. So not surprisingly, in that sense, his best event is the marathon with a 2:51, although he doesn't seem to have run too much very short distances recently. But not surprisingly, his sort of pattern fits the longer the better for him. And perhaps he could do a lot better than that 5:34 mile. I think his 5K pace isn't going to be hugely different to that. So that's not really reflective, but you can probably see that he would probably struggle to actually get that mile time as good as his marathon. But quite a tight range there, and I think perhaps got definitely room to improve all of those distances. He's still the sort of guy that's regularly doing PBs. In fact, if you look on the pink column here recently, all those PBs are recent. Now, Emma Stiles is the marathon runner 242 that does a lot of biking, in fact, more biking mileage than running. Interestingly, although her marathon was very good, her 10K is actually better, but quite a tight range here. The 10K is only marginally better than the marathon. The half marathon is very, very similar. Not really done a huge amount over 5K, I suspect, so that's not very effective, and never raced anything a mile or under. But definitely sort of fitting the pattern there with somebody who's very good in endurance, but perhaps because of that biking and not too much running, she sort of prefers the longer distances. Now, Michael Young, he's sort of a friend of mine from various Facebook groups. Now, he's definitely always sort of targeting the marathon, so it's kind of reassuring in a way that somebody who is targeting the marathon is actually best at them. I think he races a fair amount, never really on the track, I think, apart from the odd 5,000. And the other events are pretty similar, but I think that perhaps reflects the fact that he puts all his effort into marathon and treats all these other races as sort of training into stints, but doing pretty well. And all these best performances were in the last few years, so the yellow and pink columns are identical. Richard Ollington, he's the guy that I came across when he started nicking some of my Strava segments recently. He did a very good marathon 224 recently, but he's another guy with a very good all-round talent. His worst event is the mile, although it's still pretty respectable 4:28. But he got some very respectable times here, 6-7 minutes in the half marathon, sub 15 for 5K, that 224, low 31 for 10K. So those four events all pretty similar. And he was almost like tossing a coin, perhaps, of which one's the best, and perhaps reflecting the fact he doesn't race the mile so much that's down the bottom. Now, Stephen Cousins is a guy that I know quite well, best known for running on Zwift on the treadmill a lot, and he's a very good ultra runner, and he runs the YouTube channel Film My Run, where he goes and documents all these trail races and any races that he does. Now, he's recently done a sub 3 hour marathon, but his best event, interestingly, is the half marathon with an 83 there, and his 5K is better than his marathon. So perhaps another example of someone you might think would be best at the marathon because of all the ultra races he does, but in actual fact, that's not actually the case. I think that 10K down the bottom there reflects the fact that he hasn't really done a 10K in recent times. It's either 2013. I think that could be a lot better now. I think that could be around about 38 minutes. And he hasn't done any formal mile races as far as I'm aware. But yeah, interesting. I think, as I said, that someone who's best known for doing sort of 100-mile ultra races and stuff like that isn't actually best at the marathon. He's best at the half marathon. Ben Felton is the YouTuber that's recently taken that up full time. I see his subscription rates are going out remarkably. I think when I last looked, he was at 10,000. I looked the other day, he's up to 12,000. So he must have gained about 2,000 subs in about a couple of weeks, which is more than I've got almost altogether. So he's doing well. I think it's already came fourth in a cross-country race. I think his target this year is to actually run a sub-70 half marathon. It's interesting, of all the events he's done, it's actually his worst event. So if he can take 4 minutes off his half marathon, that maybe come up. But certainly I've been impressed by some of his sort of like 3K to 5K performances on the track. So interestingly, his best event group is the 5K, represented by a sub-9 3000. But I think he's someone that's going to be rapidly improving, especially as now pretty much running full time. So fourth in the Essex League in the cross country is definitely showing ability to take to a range of surfaces and distances. And I think when he comes to do a marathon, he's going to do well. He did an ultra, but he had a bit of a bad time in that one and had to sort of walk it in. But I think he's going to do a lot better in a full marathon when he comes to do one. Certainly at sub 2:30 there, Backens, I would say, looking at his other times. Now, Jonathan Walton, he's the fastest M50 marathon runner in the UK. So not surprisingly, his marathon's at the top. Another person that fits the pattern of being better the further you go. And he looks to have done 19 marathons in his career so far. Never actually raced a mile or anything shorter, so I can't even rank him there. But I think most of his 5K is probably represented by park runs. But it just goes to show that some people are just better at different events than others. So Matt Rees is somebody I've got to know reasonably well in last few years, lots of exchange of emails and stuff. So it's interesting that he sort of generally portrays himself to be a marathon runner. But it's interesting, it's only his 4th best event. He's got quite a tight range of events. I think perhaps he hasn't quite done himself justice on the marathon. I think perhaps he may have just left a bit too much in training in some of the recent ones, and that perhaps reflects the fact that his best is the half marathon then with the 68 minutes. But he's got a very good 10k, 31.5. His 5k is approaching 15 minutes. I really do think that marathon is not quite reflective of ability. So, but he's also pretty quick over the mile. I mean, I remember him doing a mile time trial during lockdown, and he was a bit of a track runner before he sort of got in more into YouTube and stuff like that. But it is actually his weakest event, although he hasn't actually done those for a few years. But I think he's the sort of person that is pretty good at everything. But I think he prefers the marathon. He's been doing some ultras recently. But it's interesting that, just another like Stephen Cousins, one you still think as a marathon runner, isn't actually their best event, and it's actually quite well down. So I wonder if that does give people some food for thought about how to adapt their training. Now, Richard McDowell is perhaps another example of the same thing. He's recently, I think he was second M40 in the recent London Marathon, but it's not quite his best event. His best event is actually a 14:33 5k, which is very impressive for an M40. His worst event is the mile, but it's still got a very respectable 4:31 mile. I mean, there's been some years I've done anywhere near that. I mean, I think I would have had to be in my early 30s before I was that good. So that's a very good time for somebody who's also running marathons, and he also runs ultras as well. So got a very good range of events. But interestingly, that the spread there, the 5k is the best and the mile is the worst. So maybe that reflects the fact he doesn't race the short events as much. But interesting there, how he can sort of turn himself to pretty much anything. Speaking of which, kind of similar with Jake Smith. I mean, he did that marathon 2:11 as a paceback and just decided to carry on. I think his best performance was in the world half, I think last year when he did 60:31. He had been targeting some 1500s around the time he was doing the marathon, and you can see that perhaps that's why James C., his coach, wants him to do that, because it's actually his weakest event. But it's very handy speed for somebody who's got a 2:11 marathon. He didn't even do it properly, so what could he do if he actually raced one properly? Very interesting to see. I mean, you just kind of think if he did race the sort of a big city marathon and treated it probably as at least a 2:7, 2:8 in there, and maybe if he in years to come, because he's very young, and he only just turned 21 or something like that, you can kind of see that Mo Farah's British record of 2:5 could be in danger, especially with a half marathon and a 60:31. He's already well accustomed to that 2:5 pace already, and then some. I think perhaps in the summer, has perhaps suffered from being a bit ambitious. I think he tried to run the Olympic qualifying time in the 10k, and perhaps that was just a bit overreaching and didn't finish. So I think that 10k time is going to come down. But interesting to see his progress and what event he actually targets, because apart from the 1500, he can turn himself from a decent 5k up to a marathon. It looks like to me that the marathon is going to be his event in years to come, but certainly being as young as he is, it's best to explore all these different distances. I mean, there was a time in sort of the early 80s when all the marathon runners came from track backgrounds. I mean, I remember Amy Martin won the London Marathon, a sub-4 miler, had a devastating kick in the 5,000. And it's a bit more different nowadays. I think people specialise in distances because I think the standard of athletics is so much higher now, and you can't really sort of do all the different distances. Adam Fogg has a British qualification, but I think his parents, one of them is British, I think. So he's a sub-4 miler, very much a miler. And unsurprisingly, his best event there is the 1500 at 3:38. But his 5k is pretty good as well, 13:45. Not that much difference in it. Run 10k on the track and a very respectable 29 minutes. But yet to run a half marathon or a marathon, not really a great deal of point running those events when you can run a sub-4 miler and you're still at college. Dave Jarrett is the guy from Haslemere that I know a bit. I was interested in him because his performances this year followed quite a similar pattern to what I was doing in 2005 when I did my last marathon. But interestingly, for someone who's just run a very good marathon, they're 2:38. It's actually his weakest event. He hasn't actually done a mile. And another example where yeah, if you think of somebody as being a marathon runner, well, actually their 5K times are actually better. So, yeah, it's sort of food for thought sometimes about these things. But all those performances were done this year, so that's impressive in itself. Jose Gonzalez is a fellow M50, lives quite local to me, and we always follow each other's progress on Strava. And interesting there, his best performances were in the half marathon with 74.56, which is London Marathon Championships entry standard, and arguably a bit better than his actual marathon at 2:46. I wonder what he would have done in the London Marathon had he not had to pull out due to catching COVID, unfortunately. I heard he's recovering well from that and was sensible not to do too much too soon. So I'm interested to see how he gets on when he's fully recovered from that. But another one with a quite a reasonable range of events. But perhaps he hasn't quite nailed the marathon. But he's only actually done 2 as far as I can see from in recent times. So perhaps definitely potential there to improve. Now, as I was saying earlier about Victoria Cousins, so she's one that was very pleased to do a sub-4 marathon in Paris. Interesting to see it's actually her weakest event in terms of my scoring system, although her half marathons are best. So it does suggest that it's all quite similar, and hopefully she can continue to progress. Ben Parks, who's a good runner, but obviously best known as a YouTuber. Again, somebody who normally is sort of doing marathons and ultras. His half marathon and marathon are his longest events. But interesting again that although he's perhaps best known as a marathon runner of all his events, it's not quite his best event. He was announcing himself as a 2:25 marathon runner rather than a 69-minute half marathon runner. But although there's a very similar performances, the marathon always gets the kudos, but not necessarily always the best performance there. And his mile is his worst, but it kind of reflects the fact he's hardly ever done it. I think that mile one was just his only ever track race, and still a very successful time, but unsurprisingly for somebody who specialises in longer events, not quite as good. Now we've got Lee Kibble and Andy Raynor side by side, who are sort of sometime training partners. Andy Raynor is the guy that runs the FOD Forest of Dean Runner YouTube site, and Lee Kibble is sometimes seen in those videos, and he's making great progress this year. All his PBs, bar the mile he's only done the once, were this year. But another example of somebody who perhaps gets most attention for his marathon there with a 2:36, but is actually only his 4th best event group, and his best is actually his 5K, and actually another one there that perhaps could do a good mile time if he actually did one. So a lot of runners, interestingly, these days don't really do sort of the mile races and 1500s that I did in my era, in the co-over era. So you wonder whether that would help some of these athletes if they did more. And Andy probably got that right, actually, because he also says that half marathon is his favourite distance, and it does come out as his best group there. Now, I've only got his 2:55 marathon because I think his actual PB wasn't in a licensed race. So I don't think that quite would actually match up with his half marathon, though, but it certainly would feature a lot better than the 2:55 I've got there. And I think that mile, I think almost his half marathon pace isn't 5:04 or 5:30, so that's not really reflective, and that was 4 years ago. But again, somebody who doesn't really race that mile distance hardly ever, and I'm surprised that's at the bottom. Ruck, who runs the Kellogg's on the Run YouTube channel, partner of Matt Rees, the Welsh runner. I think we discussed before that she struggled a bit in her recent marathons. That marathon time there, I think, was from 2019. She had been targeting Berlin, and then she also run around in London. But her park run time there in the build-up training to that was easily her best performance there, going under 25 minutes. So that was impressive, and kind of shows a lot of ability there. And I think we've discussed before that marathon time, if she can actually nail one, should be more like around about 4 hours. So I look forward to seeing if she can improve there. I don't think she's done a 10K for a while, so it kind of reflects that at the bottom, and no short races at all. Now, Chris McEwen, that running guy, he was in his youth actually a very good miler and cross-country runner. So it's interesting he's actually done a mile since he's come back into it. And But it's interesting that his best performances are in the shorter distances, the 10K and the park run. In fact, it's almost identical there. And I think you could argue that if he'd done a 5K road race, that may well come up the top. And not surprisingly, given the background, the longer he gets, the worse he gets. Although I think his marathon was his first one, so I think he's got a lot to learn there. And perhaps with a bit better pacing in the first half, because I think he ran the first half of the marathon around about 92 minutes, which is very close to his actual half marathon PB. So in a way, perhaps not surprising, he struggled in the second half. But another one, he's got a lot of ability, and I fully expect that marathon time to come down in years to come. Tony James is a fellow YouTuber, another example of somebody who, perhaps you might think he was targeting the marathon, but it's still easily their worst event. I say worst, compared to the other two. His 10K and half marathons almost identical. So again, it's kind of reflecting on the fact that the struggle with people to convert their sort of short distance times into the marathon. Ed Budd, he hasn't done too many races. I think in the last video I included his marathon time trial, but he hasn't done a short race. And most of his races have been 5Ks and a few half marathons. Another example of somebody who does best at the 5K, but I think his half marathon and 10K times are subject to revision. I think he's going to hopefully get over his shoulder injury at the moment and get back into running. I look forward to that. I think all those times are going to come down considerably. Chris Ford from FOD Runs, I think also another person you normally associate with marathons, but again, is actually his weakest event, and his best events is actually the sort of the shorter ones. 10K is his best event. I'm not sure how often he really tries in park run. He's done 28 park runs and 5Ks. Yet to done a mile race, so I think he's actually done a sub-6. So I think in a way, you might argue that his best event may be even the mile, even though he sort of more focuses on the marathon in terms of actually his YouTube content and stuff like that. But it's interesting nonetheless. Sam Baker is another fellow YouTuber, another example of somebody who's actually quite similar to me. He's naturally talented at the shorter distances, and his best performance there was that 800 at 2:09 this year. And he did pretty well in the marathon, I thought. But as you can see, again, another example of where somebody who's, as the distances goes up, he gets worse. But I think that was his first marathon, so a lot to learn from that one. And his half marathon, 83 minutes, is pretty respectable compared to his 5,000 and his 10,000. So I think it's definitely a sub-3 in there for him, but it just depends whether what his focus is going to be going forwards. Because I think there could also be even a sub-2 minute 800 in there. So I think a lot of it is about what you want to achieve in running, and you can't necessarily do everything, although sometimes I try. I did spend most of my early part of my running career focusing on the 8 and 15, and I got to the point where I probably did about as best as I was going to do in them. Then I took up the marathon, probably did about as best as I was going to do given my age. Chris Bill, another fellow YouTuber, here we are running. Another example of somebody who perhaps targets is the ultras and the marathons, but hasn't really yet nailed one to the same extent as his shorter races. He hasn't yet done a mile. And looking at his best event there is quite easily his park run at 2019, and he has actually done a time trial sub 20 on the track. So again, another example of somebody who you associate with longer events but isn't actually on paper actually as good at them. Ben Notley hasn't done too many races yet. He's done his marathon debut in London and just missed 4 hours. I think it was a very fine performance, and he's only done 2 park runs that I could find. But again, another example where the park run is slightly better than the marathon. And finally, Dan Runs, another one who also is perhaps best known for the longer races and ultras and stuff like that, but his actual performances go the other way around. His best event is the 5K, the 10K, and the half marathon and the marathon. So I've done a summary here of all these different runners, and there were 38 YouTubers and sort of athletes I know and sort of sub-elite runners and stuff like that. And of the 38, only 6 were best in the mile, and only 5, even less, were best in the marathon. So when you consider that perhaps the majority of YouTubers sort of focused on the longer events, it's interesting that how few of them actually best at them. And if you look at the worst event group, the biggest number there is again the marathon, followed closely by the mile. When I say worst, I've only included the event groups that the athletes have actually done. It's interesting, quite polarised there. Perhaps the mile is because of the lack of experience in racing in it, and the marathon is just the fact that it's so difficult to actually convert your training into a decent marathon. And for fun, I looked at sort of the specialists. Who are the people like me that sort of seem to get worse in inverted commas the further you go? And as well as myself, my friend Phil York fits into that category. Adam Fogg does, although he hasn't yet done a half marathon or a marathon. Sam Baker, a fellow YouTuber, is also pretty close to that. Mark Symes, not surprisingly, being the best 800, 1500 metre M50 in the country, is also that way. And Chris Ness as well, who also is doing very well over the short distances on the track. And going the other way, the people who are best at the marathon and get worse as the distance decreases are Stephanie Davis, the British Olympic marathon runner, Ollie Garrod, who's perhaps best known as an ultra runner and 2:23 marathon runner, and Jonathan Walton, the fastest M50 marathon runner in the UK. So perhaps not surprisingly, those three are the ones that you think, well, they're actually doing very well at the marathon and not quite so well going down, but that is reflecting their focus. And also, who are the people who are the best all-rounders? What I've defined there is what is the difference between their HT basic scores, so between the best and the worst event groups. And easily the best all-rounder is Phil Symes, only 0.45 points between his best event and his worst event. And then we had Mark Symes, Richard Ollington, Andy Greenleaf, Matt Rees, Ollie Garrod. I'm coming in at 7th. It's all quite similar there, very similar actually to Ben Parks, Richard McDowell, Jake Smith. And all the people that have only done 4 event groups, Jack Rowe is the best all-rounder, but still a wider score than Phil Sesemann, even though with an event more. Then Michael Young hasn't done a mile, Jack Rowe hasn't done a marathon, and Dave Jarrett hasn't done a mile, and Ben Felton hasn't done a marathon. Now you might think in these sort of scoring, well, maybe the scoring systems aren't quite right. So the HE basic scores there I actually took from the 2010 World Masters Association age graded tables for a senior. So there's no age bias in those. And I've put up a table here of various other popular scoring systems. We've got FOGDOG by Jack Daniels, we've got Run by Greg McMillan, and we've got the one in Run as well, which is based off the Pete Reigel's model. And also on Fetch, their race time predictor is actually exactly the same as the Run as well. But they did an interesting one where on Fetch, where he actually looked at the performances in his database, training database, against what people have actually done in marathons, and came up with a model reflecting the half marathon to marathon conversions. I just want to illustrate here, I just took some fixed points in the marathon and see how these different scoring tables compare. So say at 2:30, my one that I use for Run Britain is worth a 4:27 mile. And if you see there that 4:27 fits in with the range of all these other ones. And then as we go across, that is worth 15:29 for 5K. And again, the ones that actually predict a bit quicker and a bit slower. And similarly with the 10K, 32:14, and the ones that there are ones which are both slower and faster. Half marathon 1:11. And it's interesting that Fetch model there, it actually predicts, compared to what people actually do, a somewhat bigger range. And if we go looking up to more what I am, is probably around about the 3-hour mark at the moment. So I actually did 3:09 in under marathon, but my best mile time this year was 5:25, which wasn't quite as good as the 4:56, 1500 I did this year. But you can see some of these tables predict considerably slower than what I actually did, even though I didn't break 3 hours in the marathon. And just for illustration, all these other ones there, if you want to study those, we'll talk about that in perhaps another video, but just wanted to show that my scoring tables do kind of reflect reasonably well with the other ones. And I haven't just sort of made these up out of thin air. They do actually correspond to a known system. I just adapted it for the golf style handicap. Now, I've also looked on the Power of 10 database. I've looked at all the runners that have done 5 event groups. I wanted to see how they compared, and we're seeing kind of similar pattern. I've got 13,000 just over runners there. 13,343 have done 5 different event groups. And it's interesting to see that by far the lowest count for the best event is the marathon. Only 5% of these 13,000 or so runners have actually done their best event in the marathon. And if you actually look at what the worst event group, it's even more telling that 60% of the athletes who've done all 5 are actually worse in the marathon than anything else. And if you look at the other event groups that are best, it's quite an even split between the mile, 5K, 10K and half marathon. There's not much, there's a huge difference there. But if you look at the worst event group, that's slightly different. I think that perhaps reflects that not too many people do miles and don't really specialise in it. I think it's quite a specialist thing. You really have to do slightly different training, especially for 800s that you would do for longer distances. So I think a lot of people perhaps haven't yet optimised their ability at it, and perhaps maybe because they're not really that excited by it. So 32% of all these runners are actually worse at the mile. And then in the middle there with 5K, 10K and half marathon, it's almost noise. Very few people are actually worse at one of those events. And if you go back to the best event group, the most people are best at 5K at 33%, although the differences aren't that much. I also looked at taking out the mile. We just looked at the people that have done 5K to the marathon, because that's more reflective, I think, of the general running population. Just wanted to see if we saw anything different, and we don't really at all. The best event group out of those 4, very much the very lowest is the marathon. Only 4% of 66,686 runners are best at the marathon. And if you go down to what is the worst, it's even more telling. 77% of all these 66,000 runners are worse at the marathon than the other 3 events. And again, the 5K comes out the top. So it's quite a polarising thing, and very interesting, I think, and perhaps a topic of another day about why people struggle to actually do a good marathon. And I think, as illustrated in the tables, it's not due to the fact that my table's a bit out, but maybe those tables are wrong. I mean, I think they do reflect the sort of percentage of world records and stuff like that. So, topic for another day. Anyway, so another long-winded one. Hope you enjoyed some of this. Probably the quality isn't quite so good. I'm still on holiday, so I haven't got my full mic with me. So I'll play this back and hope it's audible. And look forward to your comments below. What is your best event group? And do you think that's correct? Does that reflect what you actually are training for most? And comments below about why you think that may be different to what you're actually targeting. So I hope you found this interesting. Look forward to the next one then. Bye.